Midway's Catalinas began taking off at 04:15, fanning out in an arc to the west from Zolo 20 degrees to 250 degrees. Today, though, the PBYs would only search out to 250 miles. Captain Cyril Simard's primary concern was ensuring that the atoll was not about to be invaded. If an invasion fleet materialized, the PBYs in the air needed the endurance to return all the way to Pearl Harbor without refueling. This had serious repercussions for Spruance, though, as it essentially deprived his carriers of longer-ranged scouting assets. In so doing, Simard also lessened the odds of Spruance's locating Nagumo and Yamamoto. Spruance's own air formations were scarcely in better shape than Midway's. Split between Hornet and Enterprise were a total of around 60 attack aircraft, plus fighters about a full carrier's worth. The Japanese would surely have traded places with him this morning, but Spruance's hand was not strong enough for him to want to push his luck. While he had sufficient Dauntlesses in hand to project meaningful firepower, many of them would need to be devoted to scouting activities. Beyond locating and attacking the Japanese, the other major task was trying to save Yorktown. Under the Hugheses' watchful presence, she had survived the night, and by morning appeared to be in no worse shape than she had been 12 hours earlier. Her commanding officer, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had meanwhile succeeded in convincing Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher that the carrier could still be saved. He wanted to put a hand-picked party of salvagers on board the carrier, try and restore power and get her out of the area. Fletcher assented. In fact, on the night of the 4th, Chester Nimitz had already ordered minesweeper Vireo and the fleet tug Navajo, which were at Pearl and Hermes Reef, and French frigate Shoals, respectively, to begin moving toward Yorktown. Unfortunately, the men Buckmaster felt he needed were scattered across all the various vessels of TF-17, which had rescued the carrier's crew. Transferring them onto the destroyer Hammond took until 11:27, at which point she began heading back toward Yorktown. Back on board Yamato, Hiryu's sighting report of Hiryu reached a flabbergasted Yamamoto and Ugaki at around 07:30. Yamato flashed a message to Nagumo. "Has the Hiryu sunk? Advise of developments and position." For his part, Nagumo was just as confused by the news as his superiors. At 08:20, the word flashed out to Tanikaze. According to reconnaissance by Hiryu plane at 07:20, the Hiryu was burning in position FURORI 43, 30 Odusengdagai 10N, 178-50 EE. A number of survivors were on deck. Investigate condition and take off survivors. Commander Katsumi Motoi duly swung his ship out of formation and raced eastward back toward Hiryu and the enemy. As events would prove, she was to have a long, dangerous day, atoning unfairly for her sister's earlier mistakes. Scarcely had word about Hiryu's mysterious non-sinking been received than news reached Nagumo concerning another derelict. At 06:52, a garbled message from Chikuma's No. 4 search plane had been intercepted by Nagara. It seemed to mention an enemy carrier. At 0800, Chikuma blinkered a full rebroadcast to Nagara. No. 4 had sighted an enemy Yorktown-class carrier listing to starboard, SIC, and drifting in position bearing 111 degrees, distance 240 miles from my takeoff point. One destroyer is in the vicinity. In due course, word went out to Tanabe's I-168, which was still loitering near Midway. He shortly set a new course to the northeast. It would take him a day to reach his new target, but from all reports, it didn't look as if this particular American carrier was going anyplace soon. The Americans were beginning to get back their own scouting reports by now. At 06:30, a PBY picked up Mogami's and Mikuma's trails. In Mikuma's case, there literally was a trail, as she was streaming a ribbon of bunker oil from her damaged fuel tanks. This PBY transmitted that it had detected 2 battleships, bearing 264, 125 miles from Midway, on a course of 265 at a speed of 15 knots. A second PBY amplified this report, describing 2 large capital ships, both damaged and one leaking oil. Captain Sakayama of Mikuma was well aware they had been sighted, sending word to his superiors at 6:23 that his position was 28 degranda 10 N, 179 degranda 30 W, speed 12 knots. Though Mikuma was capable of nearly full speed, Sakayama was loath to abandon Sister Mogami. Whatever attacks came, Sakayama resolved that he and Soji would face them together. They both knew that the main Japanese forces were well to the north and west at this time, but Captain Sakayama had wisely opted to steer due west, so as to put as much ocean between them and their enemies as possible. There would be time enough later to figure out how to rejoin the main body. The sight of an American PBY at 6:30, though, meant that the jig was up far sooner than either ship would have wished. Midway lost no time in attacking the cripples, ordering the remnants of VMS B-241 to take off immediately. At 700, Captain Marshal Zach Tyler, the squadron's third commander in 2 days, led out a flight of a dozen dive bombers, 6 Dauntlesses, and a like number of SB-2Us, divided into 2 sections. About 40 miles away from the target, the Marine aviators easily picked up Mikuma's glistening exudation and turned to follow it. Shortly thereafter, the 2 Japanese ships hove into view. Captain Tyler's Dauntless squadron attacked from out of the sun at 10,000 feet. The older Vindicators, led by Captain Richard Fleming, opted for a glide bombing attack from 4,000 feet. Mikuma and Mogami, despite their damage and very low speed, proceeded to throw up a veritable torrent of anti-aircraft fire. Tyler's men went first, but Mogami's heavy fire meant all they could manage was to sequentially deposit their bombs in the water alongside the cruiser. Next came Fleming's men. They focused their attack on Mikuma, which was on Mogami's port bow, and were subjected to a similarly withering barrage. This time, though, the Japanese drew blood as capped. Fleming's aircraft was struck almost at the outset of his dive. He attempted to control his aircraft, but went flaming into the ocean. Accounts vary as to whether pilot or gunner attempted to get out of their aircraft. Neither survived. One thing that is clear, though, is that despite popular folklore to the contrary, Captain Fleming did not crash his aircraft onto Mikuma's No. 4 turret. The most reliable witnesses on the American side attest that his plane crashed into the sea, and the only Japanese source to ever state that Fleming hit the ship was in no position to witness the event. The rest of Fleming's section all missed the cruiser with their bombs. The net result was that both Japanese cruisers emerged unscathed from their first ordeal. However, more trouble was not long in coming. Almost as soon as the American dive bombers had been seen off, a pack of 8 B-17s showed up. Under the command of Lieutenant Cole Brooke E. Allen, these came in at 20,000 feet in 2 elements of 4 aircraft each. Once again, the big 4-engined bombers merely deposited a total of 39 500-pound bombs harmlessly in the drink, mostly around Mogami. Mikuma triumphantly signalled, although attacked by 8 B-17s at 0834, we drove them off without damage. So far, at least, their luck had held out. If this was the best that 20 American bombers could manage against 12-knot targets, they might make it out yet. Indeed, as if buoyed by her good fortune, Mogami at 11:30 cranked up to 14 knots. Task Force 16 had the same information in hand as Simard, and might have attacked Mogami and Mikuma as well. But Spruance was far more interested in knowing if there were any remaining Japanese carriers to the northwest of the island. While waiting for a clearer picture to emerge, he turned due west at 09:30, passing only 50 miles north of Midway. He was now in a perfect position to foil any renewed landing attempt while evaluating the morning's reports. However, instead of a clearer picture emerging, things began to get more confusing as the morning wore on. At 0700, Midway radioed that a PBY had detected 2 enemy cruisers bearing 286, distance 174, course 310, speed 20 knots. Though Spruance didn't know it, this was Kurita's Kumano and Suzuya steaming to rejoin Kondo. At 0800, another report was received detailing 2 enemy battleships, 3 or 4 cruisers, 1 aircraft carrier on fire, bearing 324, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 310, speed 12. In retrospect, the carrier was plainly Hiryu, although it is less apparent what other vessels were in her vicinity that could have been sighted. But that wasn't all. At 0853, another PBY sighted a carrier bearing 335 distance 250 from Midway course 245 at 2020 GCT, 0820 local. Finally, at 0907, Midway rebroadcast the following: 2,800 enemy cruisers, auxiliaries and some destroyers screening burning Carrier 2 battleships well ahead of group. To Spruance and his staff, the overall impression was that there was indeed an enemy carrier still out there. On the basis of the reports they already had in hand, they were convinced that Akagi, Kaga and Soryu had been dispatched. But so far as they knew, Hiryu had only been crippled, and no one would discount the possibility that an undiscovered fifth Japanese carrier still lurked nearby. Accordingly, Spruance decided to leave Midway to the business of dealing with the two battleships while he sought bigger prey to the northwest. In the event, though, Spruance didn't end up getting a strike off until around 1512. It would have been launched an hour sooner had not a rather bizarre incident occurred on Enterprise's bridge. Captain Miles Browning, Spruance's chief of staff, drafted an attack plan that called for launching the force's SBDs at 1400. During the briefing, Enterprise's aviators were informed that they would be launching at a range of 240 miles from the contact extreme range for the Dauntless. Worse yet, upon closer examination, Browning's plan failed to account for the distance that the Japanese warships would most likely have moved in the interval from launch, meaning that the actual range was closer to 275 miles. Browning had also specified that the planes were to be armed with 1,000-pound weapons, decreasing their effective range still further. Lieutenant Shumway, slated to lead Enterprise's attack, was concerned enough about the outlines of the plan that he took them to Enterprise's Air Group commander, Wade McCluskey, who was lying in the ship's sick bay. McCluskey promptly went ballistic. Though wounded, he made his way up to the flag bridge, dragging Earl Gallagher and Enterprise's skipper, Captain George Murray, along with him. He confronted Browning in front of Spruance, contending that the mission could not be carried out as planned. Browning, without explanation, brusquely ordered the aviators to carry out their orders. McCluskey thereupon inquired if Browning had ever flown an SBD. Browning answered that he had. McCluskey then pressed him on whether he had ever flown a late-model SBD equipped with self-sealing tanks, which carried less fuel, armoured seats, a 1,000-pound bomb, and a full load of avgas. Browning admitted he hadn't. The argument quickly turned openly hostile, whereupon Spruance sided with McCluskey, saying simply, "I will do what you pilots want." Clearly, Spruance had discerned from the previous day's events that his senior aviators knew their business. Browning stormed off the flag bridge in a rage, sulking in his cabin until another staff member persuaded him to return to his duties. The upshot of this almost farcical episode was that Enterprise's aircraft, and Hornets too, had to be rearmed with 500-pound weapons before the strike went up. By the time the switch-out had occurred, middle afternoon was wasting away. Enterprise launched 32 SBDs at 1512. Hornet sent up 11 aircraft at 1530, followed by 21 shortly thereafter at 1543. Incredibly, despite the new arming orders, 7 of Hornet's scouts still carried 1,000-pound bombs. Commander Stanhope Ring, leader of Hornet's ignominious combat debut the day before, once again led her attack and commanded the lead element. Leutnant Walter F. Rhodey was in charge of Hornet's second group, including the overloaded planes of VS-8. All 3 strikes targeted the same burning carrier, the Hiryu. Of course, Hiryu had already sunk. However, there was a Japanese ship entering Ring's bull's eye, destroyer Tanikaze. She was still retracing Nagumo's earlier retreat, searching vainly for Yamaguchi and his flagship. In fact, Tanikaze had already been swiped at by some planes from Midway. At 1636, a quintet of B-17s had dropped bombs on her. All of them landed clear on either side of the bows, and Tanikaze suffered only a drenching of her superstructure. Undeterred, Commander Katsumi continued on his way. But 70-odd minutes later, Ring's 12 SBDs appeared in the skies above the destroyer. Ring had spotted Tanikaze at 17:15, identifying her as a light cruiser. As it developed, both Hornets and Enterprise's planes were to consistently identify Tanikaze as a light cruiser this day. It is likely that dusk conditions, as well as the fact Kagero-class destroyers sported an oversized forward stack, may have compounded this impression. But Ring's assigned target was much bigger, a carrier and her escorts, so for the moment he pressed on, leaving Tanikaze behind. However, after having droned through the sky for 315 miles, well beyond the estimated contact point, Ring had had enough. It was getting close to return time, and he decided to swing around and go after the one definite enemy sighted. After the past 2 days, Ring was understandably loath to let this opponent go. At about 18:08, he attacked. It was a hectic few moments for Tanikaze as the SBDs dove on her. Her report shows 26 aircraft, dropping very near misses that bracketed both bows and the starboard quarter. One miss off the stern was close enough to draw blood. Bomb fragments slashed through the aft number 3 5-inch turret, inducing an explosion that killed the entire 6-man turret crew. The reason Tanikaze rather dramatically overcounted the number of planes attacking her is that she was, in fact, shortly assaulted by an additional pack of dive bombers. Enterprise's composite squadron had been flying steadily west-northwest toward the reported position of the damaged Japanese carrier, strung out in a scouting line formed by 9 planes of VS-6 and 7 planes of VS-5. About 100 miles away from the presumed position of the enemy carrier, they had begun climbing. The ceiling was 13,000 feet, and visibility was hazy. By 1800, the expected carrier was nowhere in sight. Having overheard Ring's contact report, though, Enterprise's planes began searching to the southwest. At 1820, a lone enemy vessel was sighted, believed to be a light cruiser of the Katori class, on course west, speed 20 knots. Lieutenant Shumway logically decided to attack this target. It was growing dark, his planes were running low on gas, and as near as he could tell, there were no other enemy ships in the area. The end result was more trouble for the hard-pressed Tanikaze. Commander Katsumi must have shaken his head in frustration as he barked out orders for yet more evasive manoeuvres. The search for Hiryu was proving a distinctly hazardous undertaking, and seemed likely to cost him his own ship before sunset. One by one, the enemy dive bombers pushed over on him like kingfishers. VB-3 attacked first, beginning at 1834, followed in succession by VB-6, VS-6, and finally VS-5. Yet once again, luck was with the Tanikaze. In this, she was aided by the growing darkness, which made it more difficult to see the fleeing ship against the dark waters. Katsumi's skill as a ship handler, too, was undoubted. Tanikaze went to high speed and lurched into a series of violent S-turns. The U.S. Navy's report affirms this, saying, because of the cruiser's high speed, maneuverability, and the heavy weather conditions, a very elusive dive-bombing target was presented. As a result, most of the bombs landed fairly wide. The other thing the Americans noticed was the large volume of anti-aircraft fire as Tanikaze's crew threw everything they had at the attackers. Their prodigious efforts were rewarded. Near the end of the last attack, one stricken SBD was seen by both sides crashing directly into Tanikaze's wake. With tragic irony, this SBD was piloted by none other than Lieutenant Adams of Scouting 5, who had produced the decisive sighting of Hiryu the preceding afternoon. More than a bit frustrated, TF-16's aviators turned and began the long, dangerous flight home. They would eventually be recovered well after nightfall, and only after Admiral Spruance elected to take the rather bold step of turning on the carrier's deck lights to guide his men home. Spruance later explained that, if planes are to be flown so late in the day that a night recovery is likely, and if the tactical situation is such that the commander is unwilling to do what is required to get the planes back safely, then he has no business launching the attack in the first place. His men, in turn, demonstrated their own worth by completing a near-perfect recovery sequence on board the carriers. Only one aircraft was lost, running out of fuel just before landing. Both crewmen were recovered. Tanikaze, for her part, still wasn't quite done. At 1845, 5 B-17s commenced dropping 15 600 and 8 300-pound bombs on her from 11,000 feet. She understandably counted 11 planes, as several of them made more than one run. Tanikaze was not hit and, incredibly, seems to have been indirectly responsible for knocking down a B-17. This plane, in the heat of the attack, accidentally jettisoned its Bombay auxiliary fuel tank along with its bombs and was never heard from again. A second likewise ran out of fuel on the way home and ditched. These two were the only B-17s lost in the battle. Finally, sunset came, and Tanikaze, finding nothing in the area, was understandably happy to quit the field and quickly sped westward to rejoin Nagumo. Undiscovered somewhere nearby, Chief Engineer Aimune's cutter drifted morosely toward its eventual rescue at the hands of the enemy. As it happened, 2 other Japanese destroyers had scuttled through the waters west of Midway this afternoon, but had been lucky enough to avoid detection. These were Arashio and Asashio, hastening to join the screen of the Mikuma and Megami. At 1800 they had signalled that after finishing refuelling they expected to rejoin Megami and her sister at 0500 the following morning. Even if this duo had been detected, it is unlikely that they could have been attacked. TF-16 was through with launches for the day. It was too dark, and Asashio and her sister too far away to justify a further attempt, but Spruance knew that there would be good targets waiting in the morning. Indeed, the latest sighting reports received from Midway via Nimitz at 1941 actually said that one of Midway's patrol planes had been attacked by Japanese carrier fighters. It was true at 1812, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Lieutenant J.G. Dale S. Newell of VP-44 had had the dubious honour of finally sighting the Japanese main body. Zuiho's Cap thereupon received their own baptism of fire by chasing off the American interloper. Lieutenant Newell had come upon combined fleet at an interesting moment. Only an hour before, the last straggling destroyers of Nagumo's fleet had rejoined the main body. The Japanese were busy receiving short-action reports and cross-decking personnel. Destroyer Isokaze had pulled alongside Chikuma and was conscientiously sending over the fire and rescue party the cruiser had left behind with Soryu the previous morning. The Japanese listened nervously to the chatter indicating enemy planes overhead, but they felt that the approaching sunset would soon offer cover. Apparently it did, for other than an unknown aircraft bombing Haruna at 1700 and scoring a near miss, no other Japanese ships were attacked today. With Yamamoto, Kondo, and Nagumo now all merged into one formation, combined fleet shifted from its northwest course and headed due west as dusk drew on. They proceeded slowly, while that evening the destroyers transferred Kid Butai's survivors to Nagato and Mutsu. They were heading away from Midway, but not necessarily away from battle. Mindful that the enemy's pursuit might offer renewed opportunities, Yamamoto was not quite ready to give up yet. He would hold the Midway invasion forces on standby at a safe distance and see what developments the next day might bring. As dawn's early light broke on 6th of June, the battered second section of Crew Div 7 was still struggling to clear the battle zone. Mikuma remained more or less intact, but her speed, and thus her fate, was tied to that of her wounded sister. Shoving aside a cataract of water from her crushed prow, Mogami was still making 14 knots and had the possibility of doing even better. The sea was moderate, and the welcome arrival of Des Div 8 soon after dawn bolstered the men's spirits still further. Yet even now Admiral Raymond Spruance was manoeuvring to abort their escape. TF-16 now lay 350 miles northwest of Midway. At 0500, Spruance had put up a fan of 18 searching SBDs from Enterprise to cover his western flank out to a distance of 200 miles. It didn't take long for one of the Dauntlesses to flush out the Japanese cruisers, radioing at 0645 that he had spotted one battleship, one cruiser, and 3 destroyers steaming west at 10 knots. Besides an unaccountably slow speed estimate, though, a further distortion resulted when a garble in deciphering turned the message into a report of 1 carrier and 5 destroyers. Needless to say, this latter report, particularly its unintentional mention of a carrier, elicited immediate interest on Enterprise's bridge. The reported position of the Japanese was only 128 miles southwest of TF-16. However, recalling the goose chase after the damaged carrier just the day before, Spruance was determined to take no chances. He ordered cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans to launch their float planes to maintain contact with this new carrier. However, even as these scouts were warming up, one of Hornet's SBDs returned at 7:30 and dropped a message clarifying that it was, in fact, 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers that had been sighted. Thus, when the cruisers started catapulting their float planes at 0745, Spruance now thought he might be dealing with 2 separate enemy formations, one of which included a carrier. Spruance ordered speed increased to 25 knots on a southwest course and instructed Hornet to launch her attack group. Enterprise would follow suit as quickly as possible. Hornet already had a force of SBDs spotted on deck for just such a contingency. Shortly before 800, she began launching the first of 11 aircraft of VB-8. Another 14 SBDs, drawn mostly from VS-8, but including one apiece from VS-5 and VS-6, went up right after. 8 carried 500 LB bombs, the remainder lugged 1,000-pounders. 8 Wildcat fighters accompanied them. Considering the opponent, this was a strong strike. Leading it again was Hornet's Stanhope Ring, trying for one last shot at redemption. However, the hoped-for carrier was soon to prove a chimera. After Ring's aircraft had departed, more of the morning's search aircraft began landing, and the error in transmission was quickly discovered and corrected. There was no carrier, but there was apparently big ship game out there nonetheless. Indeed, Spruance still believed that there might be 2 separate formations in proximity to one another. At 0850, the Enterprise radioed to Ring. "Target may be a battleship instead of a carrier. Attack!" By now, the Japanese were fully aware of the way the morning was shaping up. Captain Sakiyama of Mikuma had spotted 2 of New Orleans's float planes and opened fire on them. The Americans kept a healthy distance, maintaining contact and guiding Ring's strike force right to their targets, which he sighted at 0930. As far as he could tell, though, neither of the 2 larger ships was a battleship. Remembering that 2 enemy forces had been reported, he prudently withheld his attack, instead heading west to ensure that he didn't miss any bigger game. However, the minutes ticked by, and he saw nothing. Below, the Mikuma and Mogami were passing by his left side. His flight had already missed the optimum pushover point. Still seeing nothing ahead, Ring decided that 1 contact in the hand was worth 2 in the bush. He now commenced a wide circle around to begin a second approach from ahead and out of the sun. As the attack began unfolding, the Mikuma flashed word at 0945, attacked by a large number of enemy planes and 1 seaplane in sight. At 0950, Ring led his men into their dives. The Japanese ships increased speed and began spitting out AA. As it happened, their fire proved as effective, if not more so, than that of Kid Butai's carriers 2 days before. Despite having no air cover, the Japanese gunners shot down 2 SBDs, with the loss of both of their crews. Ring was once again destined for disappointment, as his section managed no better than a paint scraper near miss alongside Mikuma. Scouting 8 had a bit more success with Mogami, connecting with 2 bombs. One landed atop number 5 turret, killing the entire turret crew. The second smashed through the aircraft deck and started fires in the torpedo room beneath it. Now Lieutenant Commander Saruwatari's earlier precaution of dumping Mogami's Type 93 torpedoes paid off. While the bomb hit was destructive, there were no secondary explosions, and the fire was extinguished within an hour. As for Desdiv 8, both destroyers were strafed, but emerged otherwise unscathed. Surveying the results after reforming his aircraft, Ring answered a query from Enterprise by radioing. No CV sighted. Attacked CA supported by 3 DD, 1 hit, enemy course 270, speed 25, no air opposition. The last part was significant, as it confirmed that there was no Japanese carrier in the area. This was a disappointment, but it seemed possible that the reported battleship was still lurking out there somewhere. Watching Ring's aviators depart, Mikuma's skipper surely wished for a Japanese carrier near at hand as well, albeit for entirely different reasons. But the fact was that Captain Sakayama's small squadron was alone on the sea, far distant from Kurita's other 2 cruisers, and even farther from any help the main body might provide. A quick tally of the damage was compiled, and then a situation report flashed to Yamamoto and Kondo at 10:45. The news still wasn't all bad. Mogami had only received light damage, and 3 enemy aircraft had been shot down. However, at exactly the same moment Sakayama was sending his report, further trouble was being sent his way. One by one, 31 SBDs began rolling down Enterprise's flight deck as she followed up Hornet's strike with one of her own. Like Hornet's morning strike, this was a polyglot unit SBDs from VB3, VS5, VB6 and VS6 were all participating. 16 planes of VS5 and VS6 combined to form one squadron, with planes from VB6 forming a 3rd division. With them went 12 Wildcat fighters. Overall command of the formation fell on Lieutenant Wallace Wally Short of Yorktown. At 10:57, while Short was still orbiting TF-16 awaiting departure of the last of his aircraft, he received an additional message indicating that the Japanese battleship was apparently somewhat farther ahead of the assigned target. Not surprisingly, he was ordered to seek it out first. A few minutes later came yet another change. Given the importance of the target, the last 3 torpedo planes remaining from VT-6 would be coming up to join him as well. At 11:15, the SBDs formed up and departed, boring away westward in lazy S-turns to let the slower TBDs puff along behind. The dive bombers climbed to 22,500 feet, leaving the torpedo planes at low altitude. Captains Sakayama and Soji had changed their own plans in the meantime. The implication of the continued presence of New Orleans's float planes was obvious and mandated a response. At 1100, the Mikuma radioed that they were under pursuit by enemy aircraft and surface ships. They were consequently shifting course to the southwest to make a run for Wake's air cover, the island being 710 miles distant. Yamamoto's staff on board Yamato could only listen with growing consternation and fear for the safety of the 2 cruisers. Their fears were well-founded, because the time had finally come for Crew Div 7 to pay the check. At noon, Mikuma was still leading Mogami west-southwest. Both ships were making close to 20 knots, with the 2 destroyers in screen. Great waves were being raised by Mogami's shattered bow as she bulled her way through the water at the best speed she could manage. This last-gasp effort was putting a severe strain on the forward bulkheads, but Captain Soji dared not slow down now. It had been 2 hours since the last American attack, and they were creeping ever closer to Wake. However, they were still at least a day's steaming from friendly fighter cover. And now, the instrument of their final ruin came into view. Wally Short's strike group had sighted the fleeing Japanese at 12:11. However, for the moment he did not alter course. The Japanese watched as the Americans flew by, heading west in search of the non-existent battleship. But even though the SBDs were headed out of the area, coming up from astern were the American Wildcats and the 3 TBDs of VT-6. The fighter leader, Lieutenant Jim Gray, feared the TBDs might attack the cruisers solo, so he led his fighters down for a closer look at the targets Short had just bypassed. The Japanese responded with another blistering AA barrage, spitting defiance back at the Wildcats. It may well be that because of her damaged bow, Mogami appeared foreshortened and smaller than her sister. For whatever reason, though, Gray and other American pilots consistently mistook the pair for one battleship and one heavy cruiser, even though Mikuma and Mogami were identical. This had an effect on the post-battle reports the Americans would file regarding this attack. However, Gray was impressed by the robust defence and large size of Japanese cruisers. He was convinced that an oversight had been made, and that at least one of the two was the battleship that everyone was seeking this morning. He promptly radioed Short, advising him to reverse course. Over the radio, Gray's pilots were remarking on the warm reception they were receiving, while Short and his men listened with growing concern. Behind them was a perfectly valid target. Ahead of their windscreens, despite excellent visibility, was nothing. All they could see was sun and empty ocean. They had already flown 30 miles west of the Japanese ships when Gray anxiously radioed that one of the past targets appeared to be a battleship. That was the last straw. With a curt signal, Short brought his entire squadron around to the east, commencing a long, high-speed approach from about 21,000 feet. His SBDs were descending from out of the sun and downwind, converging rapidly with the Japanese ships on their opposing course of about 240 degrees. Mikuma was still in the lead, and it was this ship that Short and
as
most
they began
of his
their
aviators
approach,
targeted. The Japanese formation abruptly slowed and changed course. The rearmost ship, Mogami, was coming under attack and looping out to starboard. As it developed, not all of Wally Short's squadron had, in fact, followed him on his abortive westward search. The last section in the long string of American aircraft, that of VB-3, had departed from the search ahead and attacked the rear CA. Almost immediately, 2 bombs slammed into Mogami, one amidships on the aircraft deck and the other forward of the bridge, inflicting medium damage. However, as a result of her sister's evasive manoeuvres, Mikuma in the fore began circling to starboard to conform to Mogami. This had the effect of reversing Mikuma's relative positioning, making her now tail-end Charlie in the formation. Thus, Mikuma had her attention distracted, and as a result, the Americans caught her flat-footed. Short pushed over at 14,000 feet and was in a 70-degree dive on her when she suddenly spotted the new menace and opened a heavy stream of automatic gunfire. She would keep this up until the first bomb hit. As Mikuma came out of her starboard turn, the first hit was delivered against the roof of the No. 3 main turret, directly in front of the bridge. The explosion shattered the turret, blowing a sheet of lethal fragments across the front of the ship's superstructure. Several officers, including the commander of the starboard AA guns, were killed outright. Worse, this initial hit coincided precisely with Captain Sakayama's sticking his head out a manhole cover on the top of the bridge. Severely wounded, he lost consciousness immediately and slumped backward into the bridge. Commander Takashima Hideo, Mikuma's executive officer, leapt to take charge. But 2 more bombs slammed home, blasting through the decks to shatter the starboard forward engine spaces. Great blasts of smoke and fire boiled up, and Mikuma was staggered. Bombs were still coming down, crashing into the sea and drenching the ship with towering columns of water. Takashima tried to increase speed and evade, but his efforts were cut short abruptly. Even before the last of Short's SBDs had dropped, 2 more bombs blasted the aircraft deck and tore down into the port-aft engine room, exploding with devastating force. Immediately, a huge fire broke out in the vicinity of the torpedo tubes. Mikuma quickly slobbered to a halt. She had been crushed by at least 5 direct hits and 2 close near misses, and possibly more. On board Mogami, her officers and men watched with sinking hearts as their would-be rescuer now became substitute victim. With angry spears of fire and dark black smoke pouring from her superstructure, from Mogami's bridge, Mikuma appeared so obviously finished that at 14:20 Mogami radioed as much back to Yamamoto. Though sorely damaged herself, Mogami began closing her sister to render assistance. High above, Wally Short collected his planes and found to his delight that he had suffered no losses. Arguably, this was true only because the 3 TBDs from VT-6 prudently declined to attack when they observed the accurate AA fire the Japanese ships were throwing up. The American torpedo plane squadrons had lost too much already, and Spruance had made it crystal clear to their pilots that they were not to risk themselves if the Japanese had so much as a single AA gun in operation. As a result, the American flyers began their journey back to Enterprise at full strength, having almost certainly wrecked one of their targets. Almost certainly, because even in the immediate aftermath of the American attack, there remained still some slight doubt as to Mikuma's fate. True, she was dead in the water, but 2 of her 4 engine rooms remained operable, and it might be possible to get her underway again if her fires were put out. There seemed to be some hope of the latter, at least initially. Though fires were raging amidships, she appeared to be on an even keel and was not settling visibly. Her executive officer semaphored Mogami. "I am taking command of the ship," and it seemed that order might be returning. Captain Soji did not rule out the prospect of his Mogami, or the destroyers, towing Mikuma to safety if they could avoid further attacks. But within an hour of the attack, the matter was rendered moot. Just before 1358, the fires around Mikuma's torpedo storage racks finally precipitated the calamity that was almost inevitable from the moment the first bomb landed amidships. With an appalling eruption, a number of Mikuma's torpedoes exploded. The entire aircraft deck was reduced to a blackened tangle of junk, and even the mainmast came crashing down on top of the wreckage. The ship's superstructure was left almost unrecognizable from the funnel back to number 4 turret. Far worse than the damaged topside, though, was the damage below decks. Although not obvious at first, the explosion and earlier bomb hits in the port machinery spaces had ruptured the bottom of the cruiser. Mikuma started sagging to port and settling deeper into the water. The men on board Mogami were under no illusions regarding the inevitable outcome of this misfortune. At 1358, she morosely radio-ed word of Mikuma's explosion and opined that there was little prospect of her being recovered. Mikuma might be doomed, but Combined Fleet was convinced there was still an opportunity to avenge her, and they were determined to exploit it. Just before Wally Short's attack struck home, the main Japanese fleet had broken formation and detached a fast-striking element to lunge south in support of Sakayama. From the Japanese perspective, 6th of June offered the possibility of a renewed carrier battle, this time supported by their full surface strength. At 1340, Kondo sent orders to his occupation force and Crew Div 8, the barest details of which convey something of the Japanese renewed excitement and hope of snatching victory from defeat. 1. Main force of occupation force, less Bat Div 3 and Desron 2, with Crew Div 8 destroy enemy carrier force and assist Mogami and Mikuma. Course west. 2. Supply force is waiting at position FU KON 39, 30 degrees 10N, 167 degree 50E. 3. Zui prepare to attack enemy CV. 4. Prepare to utilize full strength of all available seaplanes. 3-seaters to search, 2-seaters to attack enemy carrier with 2 ordinary SAP bombs each. One of the most incredible things about this order is Zui being ordered to prepare her aircraft for an attack. In fact, Kondo had already ordered her at 0015 to move with a single destroyer to a position to deliver air attacks to cover Crew Div 7's retreat. Zui would later turn in an illustrious battle record, and her captain, Obayashi Sueo, was destined to become a respected carrier skipper. Yet the fact was that Zui just had 9 torpedo bombers to throw into the fray, along with 6 Zeros and 6 older A5M fighters. It is stunning that the Japanese were even considering offering battle under these terms, particularly given the fact that Yamamoto was even now receiving signals that Mikuma and Mogami were undergoing a heavy air attack. At this point, the Americans had at least 3 times as much firepower as Zui, Hosho, and all the float planes the Japanese could scrape together. To say that Yamamoto was grasping at straws was putting it mildly, and it's lucky for the Japanese that they didn't come within range of Spruance's warbirds this day. Had they done so, the misfortunes they had suffered on 4th June would almost certainly have been sharply augmented. Yamamoto didn't know it, but his forces had just scored their biggest success of the entire battle. Throughout the morning, Captain Elliot Buckmaster's efforts to save the wounded Yorktown had slowly been yielding fruit. Destroyer Hammond had nuzzled up to her starboard side and put the captain's salvage party on board her just before dawn. The destroyer still lay alongside, providing power and support as Yorktown's crew busied themselves with remedying her various maladies. 5 other destroyers circled the carrier in ceaseless patrol. Yorktown's fires were now out, and her port list had already been considerably abated by both portable pumps and counter-flooding her starboard tanks. Topside, men were cutting away many of her portside guns so as to reduce the weight on her threatened flank. In the hangar, other sailors were lowering spare aircraft from the overheads and shoving them over the side. Most important of all, minesweeper Vireo had secured a tow line to Yorktown at 13:08 on the 5th and was dragging her clear at 3 knots. If things kept up, Captain Buckmaster might yet pull off one of the war's more masterful demonstrations of damage control. However, even as the Americans were labouring with a will, Lieutenant Commander Tanabe and I-168 were moving in to put an end to this particular feel-good story. This was precisely the sort of mission that Japanese submarines were built and trained to perform, hunting and sinking enemy capital ships. Japanese fleet boats were neither nimble nor terribly quiet, but there was no denying the lethality of their torpedoes if they could be put to use. And as luck would have it, Tanabe would benefit from an unexpectedly promising set of circumstances in which to set up his attack. Having crept north toward his quarry all during the 5th, he had welcomed the opportunity to travel on the surface once nightfall came. Throughout the night he cruised ahead at 16 knots, trusting in the sharp eyes and superb night optics of his lookouts to sight his quarry before he was sighted in turn. Below decks, the crew had completed preparations for an attack. Many of the men were too keyed up to sleep, and instead waited anxiously, chattering among themselves as the night wore away. At 04:10, Tanabe's confidence in his lookouts had been rewarded, as one of them shouted out that he had a contact off the starboard bow. The skipper scanned the eastern horizon himself in the growing light of dawn. Finally, there could be no doubt of it. The wounded American carrier gradually resolved itself, almost precisely where Tanabe had expected to find her. Even with his submarine still concealed in the westward gloom and his target silhouetted by the rising sun, Tanabe reacted cautiously, chopping his speed to 12 knots to cut his wake. He submerged at 0600 as increasing visibility made his approach ever more perilous. Tanabe had been determined to close as near as possible to the enemy carrier before launching his attack. Yet it would be tricky. 6 destroyers guarded her, and he had a healthy respect for American sonar. As luck would have it, though, acoustic conditions were miserable. One of the American destroyermen afterward lamented that propeller noises could not be heard at any range. This was probably an exaggeration, but there was no denying that the Americans were completely unaware of I-168's stealthy approach. Tanabe was concerned as well by the telltale wake his periscope might make on the smooth waters, and resolved to use it only sparingly during the middle portion of his approach, once every half hour, and then only for a single 5-second exposure. Instead of the scope, he would navigate using his sound gear and by dead reckoning. This was a bold move, but in his estimation of the relative risks, Tanabe was probably right again. His greatest danger under the acoustic conditions then pertaining was really from the hundreds of eyes on board the various American warships guarding the crippled carrier. Getting I-168 inside the ring of pickets to set up his attack was far from easy. Tanabe took a visual fix on the target at 15,000 meters and then started moving in. Over the next 4 hours, he risked only occasional glances with his periscope as he picked his way inward. But the fleeting visual sightings he did make revealed something odd. He was not closing on the target in the fashion he had expected. Virayo's low-speed towing of Yorktown was apparently fouling up his calculations ever so slightly. Finally, it was time to risk penetrating the inner picket line, which was about 2,000 metres from the carrier. Tanabe knew that no further periscope sightings would be possible until the final attack. The American escorts were pinging away with their sonar, and Tanabe and his men could hear them clearly. Tanabe rigged the vessel for depth charging just in case, but again their luck held. I-168 apparently benefited from a strong thermal layer, because none of the American destroyers got so much as a whisper of an echo back from her hull. Finally, Tanabe decided it was time to chance a sighting and raised his scope for a quick look. He was stunned to discover Yorktown practically atop him, a mere 500 metres away. He could clearly discern the faces of the American sailors on board her. Hurriedly retracting his scope, he realized he was now too close to the target. The torpedoes wouldn't arm before striking home. He had to come about and open the range a bit. This he did, finally reaching a position 1/500 metres from the carrier's starboard side. Tanabe noticed that during this critical juncture, the American destroyers seemed to have ceased sonar operations entirely. Tanabe knew that I-168 would get only one attack, and he was determined to make it count. The captain decided to forego firing a spread wider than 2 degrees. This was an all-or-nothing attack. He would fire his fish in a very tight pattern and hope that a number of them struck home. At about 13:31, Tanabe let fly with his first pair of Type 89 torpedoes, followed seconds later by the second pair. He immediately dove to I-168's maximum depth of 100 metres and headed toward the target, figuring that it would be safer if he were in direct proximity to a sinking carrier than if he were out in the open where the American destroyers could get at him. In the sub's cramped, sweaty control room, the men counted out the seconds since the torpedo's launch. About 40 seconds later, they were rewarded with the sound of 3 powerful detonations. Tanabe's attack was devastating. The Americans had sighted the torpedoes inbound, but there was nothing they could do about it. With no engine power of her own, and still being towed by Virayo, the men on board Yorktown had little choice but to watch the fish come in. Hammond, still nestled as she was against Yorktown's starboard quarter, was in exactly the same position. Tanabe's first fish hit Hammond dead amidships in the No. 2 fire room, blowing her in two. Ripping away her mooring lines from Yorktown, the destroyer drifted astern and started sinking immediately. Her crew began jumping into the water as fast as they could. Unfortunately, Hammond's own depth charges detonated shortly after her stern left the surface. The resulting underwater explosions crushed many of her survivors. Hammond lost 84 of her crew of 228. 2 other torpedoes rushed underneath Hammond and slammed into Yorktown at frames 84 and 95 on her starboard side, while the 4th missed astern. These 2 hits finished Yorktown. Externally, her condition didn't change all that noticeably. Tanabe's fish had struck on the opposite side of Hashimoto's, which had the effect of counter-flooding the ship still further and bringing her list down. But Yorktown's flooding could no longer be contained. Captain Buckmaster had his salvage party shut every watertight door they could, but they couldn't reach them all. The men could hear the sea pounding against the ship's centerline bulkhead in the spaces the latest torpedo hits had flooded. At 15:50, Buckmaster decided that it was best to remove the salvage party to the safety of the Virayo. He would wait out the evening in hopes that when the larger fleet tug Navajo arrived, he would be able to put the salvage party on board again and complete the repairs necessary to get her home. It was to be a forlorn hope. Tanabe, for his part, had expected the real battle to begin after he had launched his torpedoes. Destroyers Gwyn, Monaghan and Hughes did not disappoint him, subjecting I-168 to a series of violent depth-charging attacks over the next 2 hours. By the end of it, I-168's batteries were practically dead, some of the battery casings having cracked and spilled sulfuric acid into the seawater of the bilge. thereby releasing chlorine gas into the sub's hull. The fumes grew so bad that even the rats crawled out from the bilges to escape. Her compressed air supply had been reduced to the barest margins necessary to blow the tanks, and her diving planes weren't working properly. One of the forward torpedo tube seals had leaked, partially flooding the torpedo room and trimming the sub by the bow. Her lights, and then even her emergency lights, had failed, leaving the bridge crew operating by hand lamps in the increasingly foul air. By the time the Americans were through, I-168 had essentially been reduced to a wreck. Yet just at the moment when Tanabe had no choice but to surface, the Americans broke off their attack. Tanabe came up at 1640, prepared for a last-ditch fight on the surface with his deck gun. But when he emerged from the conning tower hatch, the American destroyers were retreating about 10,000 meters away. The Yorktown was nowhere in sight, leading Tanabe to believe that he had sunk her. Not wishing to stay in the neighborhood, he ordered I-168 to start her diesels so that she could move away on the surface. This was perhaps Tanabe's one order this day that was less than inspired, for the cloud of diesel smoke as the engines were fired up brought the American destroyers down on I-168 again. Tanabe had no choice but to run for it. The Americans bracketed his weaving boat with gunfire. However, the light was fading, and the heavy engine exhaust created a small smoke screen for I-168 to hide behind. Though the range was closing inexorably, none of the Americans' shots hit. Finally, having had bare time to vent the sub's atmosphere and recharge her air flasks somewhat, Tanabe took her down again, reversing course in his smoke cloud as he did so. This time the Americans seemed to have lost her. Their depth charging was desultory and ill-aimed. Eventually, Tanabe was able to sneak away for good. He would make it home to Kure, his fuel tanks nearly dry, having pulled off one of the most impressive submarine victories of the entire war. Meanwhile, Mikuma's executive officer, Takashima, was beginning to come to the same conclusions regarding his ship's likely fortunes that Mogami had already conveyed to Yamamoto. Mikuma was visibly settling. Her midships were a raging inferno, and there didn't appear to be any means of bringing her fires under control. After hearing some anxious-sounding damage control reports on the smoke-filled bridge, Takashima gave the order to prepare to abandon ship. He instructed the ship's repair parties to suspend their work aft and instead begin dragging shoring timbers to the ship's foredeck to construct life rafts. Mogami and Arashio were close at hand, while Asashio circled to provide air defense. For the moment, no enemy aircraft were in sight, and after a few more minutes, Takashima gave the order to evacuate. Since Mikuma was still burning and exploding, it was too dangerous for Arashio to approach. Mikuma's men would have to make their way over to the rescue ships either by swimming or on board rafts. The sailors started throwing timbers, vests, and anything else that might float over the side. Then they began jumping into the sea. On the ship's foredeck, the gravely injured Captain Sakiyama and others of the wounded were the first to be lowered onto the first raft. With the second raft went Mikuma's paymaster and her air officer, taking important documents and materials. Splashing into the calm sea, the rafts shoved off for Arashio. Commander Takashima watched all this stoically from Mikuma's ruined bridge. The reason he had sent the important materials with the second raft was that he would not be accompanying them himself. Though Captain Sakiyama yet lived and technically remained in command, the actual responsibility for Mikuma had fallen to Takashima. It was he who had directed the ship's final efforts. As such, he saw it as his duty to share Mikuma's fate. So he would, and unfortunately for the Japanese, so would many hundreds of others. In fact, the bulk of Mikuma's crew would be lost, for hardly had Captain Sakiyama's raft been hauled on board Arashio when a third wave of enemy aircraft came roaring in at 14:45 to attack the hapless little force. These were 23 SBDs sent up from Hornet at 13:45. With TF-16 having now closed the range to the Japanese considerably, each plane could carry the heavier 1,000 lbs bomb. This last strike didn't have fighter cover, but by then it was clear that none was needed. Blazing Mikuma was a sitting duck. Mogami and Arashio, currently hove to near her, would be in nearly as much trouble if they didn't clear out immediately. Frantically, the rescue ships began moving away from the stricken cruiser. Left behind in the water were hundreds of men, cheated at the chance for life, just when it appeared they would be rescued. Hundreds of others still remained on board the shattered Mikuma, some of them by their own preference. One of the latter was the commander of the main battery fire control center, Lieutenant Koyama Masao. When Takashima ordered abandoned ship, Koyama had refused to go, and instead asked his senior petty officer to be his second as he committed harakiri, ritual suicide, atop a forward gun turret. Having not been able to see his guns smash the enemy, he could at least perform this final service. Against the tragic backdrop of Mikuma's loss, many Japanese subsequently found some comfort in the telling of Lieutenant Koyama's heroic dedication to his duty. If the indications are correct, Koyama was already dead by the time the third attack wave struck the vessel. The American bombers dove at around 1500. Mogami and Arashio did not have a chance to move too far from Mikuma before the enemy was upon them, the ocean churning into froth around all three ships from exploding bombs and bullets. The Americans pressed their attack with the same ferocity as before, but not so accurately. Even so, both cruisers were hit again, and one of the destroyers as well. Destroyer Arashio took a bomb hit near her No. 3 turret aft. Tragically, it exploded among the massed survivors of Mikuma, who had just been pulled from the water. 37 men were killed outright, and the commander of Desdiv 8, Sea Dr. Ogawa Nobuki, was wounded. This same hit started a fire and knocked out Arashio's steering. Fortunately for the destroyer, no further damage was forthcoming, and the fire was soon extinguished. Though forced to resort to manual steering, Arashio was subsequently able to escape, following Mogami and Asashio west. Her sister Asashio had not been struck directly, but had lost 22 men to strafing. Mogami took a bomb on the seaplane deck, which started a horrendous fire near the ship's sick bay. All the doctors and orderlies were either killed outright or wounded, leaving the wounded men unable to save themselves as the fires roared in. Worse yet, this was at least the third hit near the aircraft deck in the same day, and the bulkheads had been badly warped by the blasts. As a result, many of the escape hatches in the vicinity had been damaged. The conflagration was spreading, and Lieutenant Commander Saruwatari once again made the tough call of taking the apparently unmerciful step and ordering the entire compartment sealed off by closing all the undamaged hatches around it. This wrenching decision gave damage control the crucial edge they needed. At length, the raging fire was checked and gradually brought under control. Saruwatari later recalled that when the compartments were reopened, it was found that several men had indeed been trapped and perished there. Their bodies were found contorted in their last throes next to the dogged hatches. One sub-lieutenant had clearly committed harakiri to end his life before the fires burned him alive. Saruwatari trembled with great sorrow to see the bodies of his shipmates thus, but Mogami's damage control officer had once again made the critical decision that saved his ship. Fortunately, despite the bomb hit and fire, Mogami's engines remained operable. After a series of quick inquiries with the two destroyers, Captain Soji took stock of the situation and decided his course of action. At 1500, Mogami radioed the word of the third attack and reported that she, Mikuma, and Arashio had sustained bomb hits. Mikuma was done for, and the same would hold true for Mogami if she didn't vacate the area immediately. More than 3 hours of daylight remained, meaning that further attacks might be forthcoming. Thus, with heavy hearts among the men, at 1525 Mogami set a course due west with both destroyers, leaving Mikuma and her crew to their fates. Between them, the three ships had only managed to pull her dying skipper and 239 other officers and men on board. By some miracle, Mogami's speed mounted steadily until she was making around 20 knots. Given her damaged state, this was rather incredible, a fact that was remarked on by Ugaki, who wryly noted. At 15:25, Mogami reported that she was heading due west at 20 knots to lure the enemy toward our main force. That Mogami, with her bow damaged, managed to put up such a high speed is partly because her damage control has progressed, and also partly because she made a desperate effort to get out of a trap. Mogami would make good her escape, rejoining Cond's Second Fleet the next day. Though her fire amidships had been contained, it wasn't totally extinguished until several hours after sunset. Later, dockyard workers found 800 large or small holes in portside, the effect of which was to turn the ship's flank into something like a honeycomb. Surprisingly, Mogami's casualties totalled only 9 officers and 81 petty officers and men killed, with another 101 wounded. She was fortunate indeed to have survived at all, and at the top of the list of reasons why must stand the courageous actions of her damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Saruwatari. Left behind by her consorts, Mikuma continued burning and slowly settling. She lingered on for at least 4 hours or more, increasingly heeled over to port, but not trimmed noticeably by either the bow or stern. No Japanese warship would ever see her again, but her last hours would achieve graphic immortality thanks to the U.S. Navy. This latter fame came about because the American pilots returning to TF-16 could not agree on what it was that they had attacked. Many of the aviators were convinced Mikuma was a battleship, while others thought she was a cruiser of some kind. There was even less agreement on Mogami's identity, and given her smashed bow, this is perhaps not surprising. Spruance listened to these conflicting reports with growing impatience, for if his men had missed the battleship previously reported, he wanted to know about it while there was yet time for a final strike. Finally, at 15:53, Enterprise launched 2 SBDs to photo-recon the targets and settle the argument. The Japanese ships were by now little more than 90 miles away, but there wasn't much time to get the job done. Dusk was approaching. However, there was still plenty of light at 17:15 when the pair of SBDs arrived above the stricken Japanese cruiser. She was floating forlornly in the hauntingly beautiful glow of the coming sunset. They marked Mikuma's position as 29°28 N, 173°11 E. The planes circled slowly at about 100 feet as the camera shutters snapped, freezing Mikuma in all her dreadful agony. Though Mogami was now long gone, the photoplanes did see her far on the western horizon, in position 29°24 N, 172°20 E, on a westerly course. They also noted 2 destroyers with her, apparently trying to screen the damaged cruiser with smoke. Shortly thereafter, the Americans left Mikuma to her fate. One of her few survivors would later recall that it was about dusk when her list to port began to increase more rapidly. Finally, with a great billow of smoke and steam, she turned onto her port side and sank, the first Japanese cruiser to be lost in the war. The approximate time and position was 19:30 at 29°28 N, 173°11 E. Partly because of the ferocity of the fires and explosion, but mostly because of the curtailment of the rescue operation, the loss of life upon Mikuma's sinking was extremely heavy. A full 700 officers and men of her nominal crew of 888 perished. Included among them was her captain. As if his spirit was seeking to hasten to rejoin his fallen warriors, Captain Sakayama Shakao would later succumb to his wounds and die on board Suzuya on 13th of June. Further west, Captain Soji, on board Mogami, did make one last attempt to avert the loss of life he knew would accrue from Mikuma's sinking. After sunset, he ordered Asashio to return and make every effort to rescue Mikuma's survivors and later rejoin us. Asashio apparently did so, but found nothing in the darkness apart from dark waters covered with even darker oil. According to her log, not even one survivor could be rescued. Yet 2 men ultimately escaped the fate of their ship and were eventually rescued by the submarine Trout on 9 June. One was Chief Radio Man Yoshida Katsuichi. The other was a third-class fireman named Ishikawa Kenichi. When rescued, Yoshida was suffering from crushed ribs and required hospitalization and could provide few details of Mikuma's final hours. Ishikawa, however, was only 21 years old and in good health. After Mikuma went down, he and Yoshida found themselves with 17 other sailors on a raft. They drifted through that night and all the next day. One by one, all but these two had succumbed to their wounds or the lack of food and water. The Japanese did not know it, but by the evening of the 6th, the Battle of Midway was all but over from the victor's point of view. Admiral Spruance had decided he had pushed his luck far enough. His carrier forces had now reached a point over 400 miles west of Midway. The risk of submarines and air attack was growing with each mile. He was also determined not to be drawn into range of Wake Island's bombers, nor to blunder into Yamamoto's powerful surface guns, both of which aims the Japanese were energetically trying to bring about. More concretely, the majority of his destroyers were getting critically low on fuel. Accordingly, he gave the order at 1907 for TF-16 to reverse course, suspend any further chase, and head for Pearl. All that remained for the Americans now was to continue their anxious search for survivors on the vast ocean. The Japanese, however, were as yet unaware of their opponent's decision to withdraw, and for them it would take one more day for the curtain to fall. Dusk on the 6th on board. Yamato found Yamamoto and his staff in a state of growing unease. From where they sat, the American carrier fleet appeared to be in pursuit, and there was now a concern that the invasion force itself might soon be endangered. Preliminary estimates had concluded that the American force harrying the Mikuma group contained 1 or 2 carriers with accompanying cruisers. But this was only part of the enemy force, at least when the available intelligence was collated. The Japanese now believed that no less than 5 or 6 American carriers had been concentrated in the Midway area during the battle, out of which only 2 had been destroyed so far. The Japanese considered it reasonable to assume that even counting their battle losses, the enemy still had 3 or 4 carriers, including converted ones on hand. Of these, it was further assumed that at least 1 regular carrier, 2 converted carriers, several destroyers and cruisers were in immediate pursuit of the Japanese forces. It was guessed that these American carriers would first finish off Mogami and the 2 Desdiv 8 destroyers. Then, after temporarily withdrawing east, it was expected that they would turn again and attack the invasion force on the morning of the 7th. This would never do. Accordingly, at 1550, Yamamoto decided he would take the main body south after Kond to guard against this worst-case scenario. Simultaneously, he hoped to lure the enemy carriers within range of Wake Island's bombers. With any luck, a close night engagement could be forced in this way too. The alternative was to risk waiting until the morning of 7th of June, braving a hail of enemy air attacks, and then hoping to charge into the enemy's midst. If all the available planes from Zui and Hosh could somehow destroy the enemy's flight decks, the main body might make it into gun range. Doing so, however, would require rescheduling the fleet's appointed refueling rendezvous a second time. This had originally been scheduled for morning of the 6th, but had been moved back 24 hours to the morning of the 7th. Now it was shifted again, and the tankers told to proceed to a different locale by the next afternoon, with fueling most likely to occur on the 8th. It was likewise decided to shift the tanker train further south, as Ugaki feared that while Kond was rushing south through fog at 20 knots, he was not paying attention to anything other than rescuing the second half of the 7th Cruiser Division. In other words, in his zest to rescue Mogami, Kond might well run out of fuel. In fact, Kond's wasn't the only formation in such danger. Yamamoto's own destroyers were running low as well, making the refueling of Desron 3 and Desron 10 absolutely essential. The only way to do so was from the fleet's battleships, and shortly after 1700, the main body swung around to course 040 and began refueling its escorts. During the same period, the opportunity was taken to shift more of Kid Butai's survivors from the crowded destroyers to Nagato and Mutsu. Finally, after each destroyer had taken on an average of 150 tons of fuel, Refueling was suspended at 23:30. 15 minutes after midnight, Yamato came about and resumed her dash southward at 18 knots. In these early morning hours of 7th of June, Yamamoto tried to grab whatever rest he could. But it was difficult, for he was suffering from an acute stomachache, later discovered to be an infestation of roundworms. Under the circumstances, the chief's condition concerned Ugaki and his staff almost as much as the possibility of contact with the enemy. There was one bit of good news, though. From the north came word that Hosogaya's Aleutians force had made a successful surprise landing on Kiska Island at Aero 120. Not long after, word came that Attu Island had been taken as well. A long, uncertain night followed, with nerves taut and tensions high, as Kon's force might report engaging the enemy at any moment. However, the morning brought neither enemy attacks nor even snooping planes. At length, Kond reported that he had sent out search aircraft far and wide, but had found only empty sea. Even longer-ranged searches from Wake Island came back with the same negative answer. It gradually dawned on the Japanese that the US carrier force had withdrawn from the scene. Ugaki remarked at this point that we had no choice but to give up our intention of launching an all-out counterattack with the whole combined fleet. These words signalled the abolition of the final Japanese hopes of somehow reversing the verdict of what more than one called the tragic battle. Spruance's prudence had paid off. For the Japanese, it meant that saving Mogami and Desdiv 8, despite their being considered doomed for a while, was the only apparent consolation prize of the battle, along with securing 2 miserable mist-shrouded islands in the Aleutians. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, though, the dawn of the 7th brought the final, and clearly the most important, Japanese accomplishment of this otherwise disastrous campaign. At 05:01, Yorktown finally sank. It had been apparent during the dawn hours that her end was near. Finally, at 4:43, she had turned completely onto her port beam ends, revealing the deep wounds left by Tanabe's strike. For some time she just lay there, like an exhausted, harpooned whale. Then the stern began to lower, until at last gallant Yorktown lifted her bow ever so slightly and slid stern first beneath the waves, descending gracefully 3 miles to the seabed, carrying 57 dead with her. There she would lie in sepulchral darkness for nearly 56 years, until rediscovered in 1998 by an undersea expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard. Even now, with the end of the battle clearly in sight, certain loose ends vexed the harried and tired combined fleet staff. Since Tanikaze's run back toward Hyeri had been interrupted, the carrier's final fate remained unclear. It was felt that if she had actually been boarded by the enemy, then they would have intercepted some indication of this in the Americans' radio traffic. However, submarines dispatched to confirm her sinking found nothing. As a final, and as it developed, futile ruse, the heavy cruisers Miyoko and Haguro, 1 destroyer division and a tanker, were ordered on the evening of the 7th to try and lure the enemy westward with false messages. This effort, like all the others before them, came to nothing, though they kept at it till 13th of June. However, with sunset and the descent of darkness on the 7th, at long last it was time for most of Combined Fleet to begin its weary, disconsolate voyage back to the inland sea. Apart from some designated reinforcements to the Aleutians covering forces, the rest of the fleet was now going home. Yet as the fleet's course was adjusted at midnight, there came a final ignominy. During the turn to starboard, destroyer Isanami slammed her starboard bow into destroyer Uranami's port side amidships. Uranami received damage to her funnel uptakes, cutting her speed to 24 knots, but Isanami got the worst of the encounter. A metre of her bow was chopped off, and she could consequently make only 11 knots. Once again, a collision had dangerously cut the speed of 2 vessels. Though the fate of Mikuma and Mogami was still fresh in everyone's mind, Desron III's flagship, the light cruiser Sendai, stayed behind with her wounded charges. But by now the enemy was far behind, and Sendai would shepherd her little ones home without incident. the accident only stretched already worn nerves, and now even the fiery Ugaki was truly ready to be quit of the whole debacle. Yamamoto had long since decided likewise. The Battle of Midway was over. Emperor Hirohito had not learned of how the Battle of Midway was going till nearly the end of the day on 5th June, Tokyo time, when an official of the Naval General Staff found the courage to inform the Emperor of the disaster then unfolding. Stunned into silence, Hirohito had withdrawn and had held audiences only with naval staff officers, after which he largely kept his own counsel on the matter. Even Lord Privy Seal Kido Koichi, one of the most trusted members of Hirohito's inner circle, was not informed of the disaster until 8th June. Kido's diary of that fateful meeting shows that Hirohito chose to put a brave face on the matter, despite Kido's assumption that the news of the Navy's losses would cause him untold anguish. However, the Emperor's countenance showed no trace of change. Hirohito went on to declare that though the loss was regrettable, the Navy should not lose its fighting spirit. He told Kido that he had ordered Admiral Nagano to ensure that future operations continue to be bold and aggressive. For his part, Kido was suitably moved. "I was very much impressed by the courage displayed by His Majesty today, and I was thankful that our country is blessed with such a good sovereign. There is some question, though, whether or not the cloistered emperor truly understood the full import of the calamity. What is clear, however, is that Hirohito assumed an active role in covering up the matter. On 10th June, at a Joint Command Liaison meeting, the Navy made a presentation on the battle that concealed the true magnitude of the losses from the Army representatives present. Thus, the Army was left in the dark for some time afterward regarding the Navy's ability to carry out further operations. Moreover, Hirohito took steps to ensure that news of the disaster was tightly controlled, both within the military and Japanese society. Outside of the Emperor and top members of court, almost no civilian in Japan knew what had happened. Even the knowledge disseminated among the ranks of the military was carefully controlled. On 9th June, Hirohito designated General Ando Kisaburo, a devotee of Tojo, to serve as minister without portfolio in coordinating this task. It was a shattered, sombre fleet that re-entered Hashirajima on the afternoon of 14th June. The final run-in toward Japan had been tense, jittery, and full of submarine alerts. Dense fog hung over the inland sea, so much so that the main body had had to be guided through the narrow Bungo Suido by aircraft sent out from the Saeki Naval Air Group. Yamato dropped anchor at 1900. As she did so, she was met by a launch from Nagara, which had made port the day before. Though he had been asked to report on the 15th, with a commendable sense of duty, Admiral Nagumo chose to face Yamamoto without delay. The following morning, Nagara drew near battleship Kirishima. A file of boats then ferried the exhausted and frustrated officers of 1st Air Fleet over to her, as she had been designated the temporary headquarters of the Mobile Fleet. Once on board, Lieutenant C. Dr. Yoshioka Chuichi, 1st Air Fleet's Assistant Staff Air Officer and Commander Genda's right-hand man, began working on completing Nagumo's official report. It was already overdue, and Yoshioka had significant obstacles to surmount in compiling it. Not only did the excessive secrecy interfere with his fact-checking, but only two major sources of documentation had been rescued from the destroyed ships: Akagi's logbook and the detailed action reports of the 4 carrier air groups. From these, Yoshioka was charged with compiling a chronicle of the action. Given the lack of available materials from the carriers, he was understandably obliged to fall back on the reports of Bat Div 3, Crew Div 8, and Desron 10. He interviewed Nagumo and appended the Admiral's written battle summary. Despite time pressures, Yoshioka ultimately completed his task with commendable skill. The result was the famous Nagumo Report, which described the actions of 1st Air Fleet from 27th May to 9th June 1942. The report is dated 15th June 1942, although reports were filtering in as late as 21st June. While Yoshioka and First Air Fleet staff were thus cloistered, the rest of the fleet was recuperating, reprovisioning, and caring for the wounded. Sadly, for many of the men, making it back to port was only the beginning of their ordeal, rather than the end. On 11th June, Hirohito issued a directive to the Naval General Staff that might have caused many of the sailors to doubt His Majesty's benevolence, namely that the Midway wounded were to return to Japan under tight security and be forbidden contacts until they could be healed, heartened, hushed, and reassigned. This policy was put into effect as soon as the fleet reached Hashirajima. The wounded were transferred to the hospital ships Hikawa Maru and Takasago Maru, which in turn transported 280 and 338 cases, respectively, to naval hospitals at Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka. Many of the men were classified as secret patients and quarantined in special wards, cut off from both other sailors and family alike, in order that no word escaped regarding Kid Butai's destruction. Both Fuchida and maintenance man Arimura suffered these indignities, as did Soryu's badly burned executive officer, Sidoctor Ohara Hisashi. Only specially cleared nurses and doctors were allowed into the wards, and there were fewer of those than need wanted. No communications in or out, not even letters from home, were permitted. Some of the men weren't allowed to leave for a year or more, and were shamed by the medical staffs at having been defeated. Those left uninjured were also deemed second-class citizens. Many of the surviving officers were dispersed to outlying commands. The bulk of the enlisted men were designated as replacements for units in the South Pacific and were sent there as expeditiously as possible. No home leaves were allowed. The survivors thus were denied a final chance to say goodbye to family and loved ones before being shipped to the Southern Theatre, where many of them would ultimately meet their deaths. Thus, the Imperial Navy compounded its own errors by treating its own men shamefully. Civilian cameraman Makishima Teyushi, who had filmed the attacks on both Akashi and Kaga, only to lose his priceless footage in the subsequent fire, found himself in an internment camp of sorts for several weeks. Even when released, he was warned not to go to Tokyo, or he would be arrested by the Kempeitai, the dreaded military police. He too was shortly shipped back out to the South Seas, far away from anyone to whom he could spill the beans. To the Japanese public, the battle was portrayed as a great victory. On 11th June, for instance, the Japan Times and Advertiser trumpeted "Navy scores another epical victory" and claimed 2 American carriers sunk. Within days, another American heavy cruiser and submarine were added for good measure. Japanese losses were left curiously vague, although an 11 June broadcast with prominent civilian naval commentator Ito Masanori noted that Japan had lost 2 carriers in return. Nevertheless, this was a small price to pay, Ito said, considering the brilliant war results obtained off Midway, which were beyond all imagination. The latter statement was certainly true, but not in the way Ito intended. This marked a rather radical departure in the history of Japanese wartime propaganda. Up until then, it had been customary to provide filtered views of the fighting in China that avoided unpleasant details. However, the Japanese news had not previously resorted to telling blatantly fabricated lies. Hirohito, though, was pleased with the public's response, and the next day floated the idea of issuing an imperial rescript to the commanders at Midway commemorating Midway. Hirohito's advisers, however, persuaded him otherwise, pointing out that things were not so desperate as to lower His Majesty's heretofore sacred pronouncements to the level of propaganda. From the Midway wounded, however, there was no way that the disaster could be concealed entirely. Maeda Takeshi, recovering from his leg wound, found out about the Navy's cover-up when one of the nurses snuck a copy of Asahi Shimbun, Japan's leading daily newspaper, into his ward. There, large as life, were the headlines that Maeda knew were all a big lie. To Maeda's way of thinking, if Japan had to resort to such outrageous deceits, it couldn't win the war. On 10th of June, the Navy Ministry had sent a message to its commands declaring, "It was decided to quote our damage in the Midway sea battle as 1 carrier lost, 1 carrier heavily damaged, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, and 35 planes failing to return. Officially, Ugaki announced on the 15th that, except for those made public by the General Staff, nothing should be revealed about Midway and the Aleutian operation inside of as well as outside the Navy. In the Navy it would be announced that Kaga was lost, while Soryu and Mikuma were seriously damaged, but their names would not be announced in public. The final policy on how the Battle of Midway was to be understood or reported, even in official communications, was fixed and issued on 21st June. A bulletin by the Chief of Staff for the 6th Fleet spelled out the new orthodoxy. As for the ships lost and heavily damaged at Midway, the policy about announcing is that secrecy will be maintained and discretion manfully exerted. Kaga, Soryu, and Mikuma will be taken off the ship's register when there is suitable opportunity. Akagi and Hiryu will remain on the ship's register for the time being, but will not be manned. The reassignment of crews will be ordered gradually. Concerning those KIA, the Personnel Bureau and Personnel Section will gradually notify the families of the deceased, but the name of the ship sunk will not be mentioned. The policy is to handle the killed merely as individuals. Concerning damages, Akagi and Hiryu both caught fire and were heavily damaged. Tanikaze, Isokaze, and Arashi, each slightly damaged. Mogami, Isonami, and Uranami were hit, Mogami moderately damaged, and others slightly damaged. Thus, the need for secrecy trumped all other considerations. This gives an indication about how the aftermath of the battle was discussed, even into the post-war years. In an immediate sense, the admission that Akagi and Hiryu were so heavily damaged as to be unmanned may have been just a face-saving move. Reading between the lines, it still meant that all 4 carriers had been knocked out. What is equally intriguing is the point-blank obfuscation regarding Akagi and Hiryu's scuttlings, despite literally thousands of witnesses. Similarly, one wonders why there was a difference between the details of Soryu and Kaga's fabricated fates and those of Akagi and Hiryu. It suggests that the scuttling of Soryu and Kaga may even have been concealed from the Naval General Staff after the battle. Given such an atmosphere, it is not surprising that many of the records of the battle, ship's logs, war diaries, etc., were destroyed after the war. No such indignities as were heaped on the Navy's wounded were inflicted on Combined Fleet's leadership or staff, despite their bearing most of the immediate responsibility for the catastrophe. In fact, to outward appearances, nothing happened that would indicate a great battle had just been lost. No announcements were made, no heads rolled, nor were there any major changes made to staff appointments. Admiral Yamamoto was still in charge of Combined Fleet. Admiral Nagumo was put back in charge of the new carrier force centered on Shokaku and Zuikaku. To the Western observer, this all seems rather incredible. After all, Yamamoto and Nagumo had just presided over a naval disaster rivaling Salamis or Trafalgar. Without delving too deeply into the reasons and responsibility for the disaster, we'll deal with that shortly, the fact remains that in a Western Navy, a failure of this magnitude would most likely have resulted in the swift punishment of any responsible parties. At the very least, careers would have been ruined. Yet, Nagumo continued in his current role until October 1942, and Yamamoto would remain head of Combined Fleet until his death in April 1943. How did this occur? The short answer is that even in the wake of his greatest defeat, Yamamoto was still in a position of strength. First, at least in the eyes of the Japanese public, which had been fed a steady diet of victory since the outbreak, Yamamoto was the genius behind the Navy's triumphs. Having just proclaimed Japan's most recent victory, cashiering a man who spent a significant portion of his time answering adulatory fan mail from the nation's schoolchildren would raise ugly questions as to why he was being replaced. Indeed, even in the dark days of late 1944, when any fool could tell that the war wasn't going well, Japan's military never had the moral fortitude to admit that it had lost so much as a single battle to date. With the Navy already in cover-up mode after Midway, how could anyone, even within the Navy, come out and say what needed to be said? This speaks volumes about the larger needs of the Navy as an organization, that the assessment of responsibility and the ability to truly learn from the battle was secondary to preserving internal solidarity and organizational loyalty while maintaining outward appearances. It must be remembered that the defeat at Midway had an impact on inter-service relationships with the Army. The underlying tensions between the two services remained fixed, and it is almost certain that the Navy would have wanted to prevent the Army from making any hay as a result of the defeat. Indeed, the Navy initially concealed the full extent of its losses, even from Tojo, despite the fact that he was the head of the government. As such, it is perhaps not surprising that the Navy was reluctant to undertake dramatic shake-ups in Combined Fleet's command structure. The same motivation was true for Naval GHQ. Admitting failure at Midway also meant admitting that the Navy's strategy-making procedures had been hijacked by a subordinate command. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, numerous incidents of such insubordination had occurred within both branches of the services. The truth was that superior commanders within the Japanese military hardly ever brought their subordinates to heel, and Admiral Nagano wasn't about to start with Yamamoto. While the Japanese utterly failed to come to terms with their defeat at the level of high command, the Navy itself did make adjustments. In the area of carrier design and operation, for instance, the Japanese reacted in several ways. First and foremost, a higher proportion of refueling and rearming activities were now to be performed on the flight deck. It was recognized that the enclosed space of the hangar, while better sheltered, also held the potential for disaster should a hit be taken. Japan's carrier designs also morphed to meet the perceived threat. Carrier Taiho, then building, would sport a heavily armoured flight deck, as would supercarrier Shinano converted from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship. Both of these carriers were intended to operate in the fore of any new battle, serving as armoured refuelling points for the air groups of the more vulnerable fleet carriers coming up behind. These latter vessels, the carriers of the Unryu class that would emerge in 1944, were almost carbon copies of the basic Hiryu design. Yet they would incorporate important improvements. Each had only 2 elevators, augmenting the strength of the flight deck, albeit at the cost of slowing deck operations. Increased use of foam firefighting equipment was incorporated, and the Navy also began to employ the American technique of draining fuel lines when not in use. Portable damage control equipment, such as gas-powered pumps, would begin making its appearance later in the war as well. Not surprisingly, the whole topic of damage control procedures was reappraised, particularly with respect to firefighting technique. Accordingly, new courses for damage control were established. Specially selected enlisted men from the ship construction and engineering branches were given 1-week courses at the workshop and repair school in the fundamentals of damage control technique. Likewise, all line officers were given at least some training, amounting to about 2 weeks during wartime. However, the Navy was churning out officers and enlisted men at a prodigious rate. Training for line officers had fallen from 3 years to just 18 months, and that of enlisted men had dropped from 6 months to 4. A few weeks' worth of training was hardly sufficient to transform raw recruits into seasoned practitioners, especially when it appears that much of the training was less hands-on than simply watching demonstrations in firefighting given by the experts. This was compensated, to a degree, by regular exercises aboard ship. However, Shokaku's, Hiyu's, and Taiho's subsequent losses because of faulty damage control, particularly with regard to firefighting technique, leaves open the question as to whether or not the Japanese actually made significant strides in these areas after Midway. Pilot training also had to be accelerated in the wake of such a serious defeat, and the Japanese took steps in this direction as well. The numbers of cadet pilots graduating had already increased in 1941, although they would not swell dramatically until 1943. In this way, the Japanese managed somehow to continue fielding air units throughout the theatre. However, the way in which the Japanese went about fulfilling their needs was far from optimal. Given their numerical inferiority, it was inevitable that the length of training would decline as the war went on. Yet the Japanese made no effort to ensure that the training that was provided was of the best possible quality. This, in turn, was linked directly to the uncaring attitude with which the Japanese military treated its human capital. Unlike the United States, which rotated experienced aviators home and then either promoted them to squadron commands or put them into training billets, Japanese aviators were rarely furloughed. Often, this was simply the result of vast difficulties encountered by Japan's overworked merchant marine in moving men and material around such an enormous battlefield. But the common lament in the forward squadrons became "Shinanakute wakeishite moraenai." They won't let you go home unless you die. The outcomes of Japan's belated expansion of her pilot training program were twofold. First, the vital knowledge and techniques of the veteran airmen were not passed along in turn to the newer Japanese aviators being rushed into service. As a result, these youngsters were fed raw into combat against increasingly well-trained American pilots. The quality of Japanese air groups, as a result, became increasingly uneven, with diminished cohesiveness in comparison to the elite early war squadrons. Often, too, these replacement pilots made crucial mistakes early in their combat careers that led to their simply being killed off, when a similar error in training might have been caught and corrected had more experienced instructors been present. Japan's combat aircraft, which lacked adequate protection for their pilots, only compounded this trend. Thus, by the end of 1942, Allied intelligence had already noticed the beginnings of a sharp decline in the effectiveness of Japanese air units. This was negatively reinforced by the second major outcome of Japan's misguided pilot rotation policy, the deterioration of the veteran aviators themselves. Caught in the horrendous physical conditions of the South Pacific, where heat, humidity, disease, and poor food and water were the norm, and subjected to the unremitting strain of combat, many of the early war veterans inevitably fell apart physically and emotionally. Despite their fearsome early war reputations, Japanese aviators weren't supermen, and no one could reasonably be expected to continue functioning under such conditions indefinitely. As a result, even men with hundreds of hours of combat under their belts became increasingly sloppy and uncaring. In a military that already took the word fatalism to new extremes, the results were inevitably much higher casualties among senior aviators than real need demanded. As 1943 opened, therefore, airmen from the pre-war cadres were more and more difficult to find. They had almost all been killed. Intriguingly, one of the most immediate effects from the Battle of Midway was a change to Japanese carrier doctrine. In this area, at least, the Japanese made an honest effort to diagnose and correct what had gone wrong. In fact, this process actually began before the fleet anchored at Hashirajima. At 800 on 10th of June, as the main body was still steaming back to Japan, Yamato had requested Nagara to come alongside. One by one, the members of 1st Air Fleet staff were winched over to the battleship via breeches buoy. They were then shown below to meet with Yamamoto in the Admiral's cabin. It was an emotional moment. Ugaki remarked later that Nagumo's staff were still in their heavy winter uniforms and looked considerably exhausted by their ordeal. The atmosphere was uncomfortable. Kusaka, ashamed, started the briefing by saying, "Admittedly, we are not in a position to come back alive after having made such a blunder, but we have come back only to pay off the scores some day." He had concluded by asking Yamamoto to give them another chance. Yamamoto, obviously deeply moved, replied that he would. Kusaka had then proceeded to report on the reasons for the disaster. Among other things, he noted that the searches on the flanks of the carrier force were not sufficient, and opined that it would have been better to have launched some aircraft earlier in the morning, before daylight, with others launched closer to dawn. Here, indeed, was the genesis for the more sophisticated two-phased searches that would later be formalized within the Imperial Navy's scouting doctrine. Kusaka, rather presciently, also anticipated the need for functionalizing the carrier divisions within a task force, including using one group for attacking and another for maintaining the readiness of a reserve force. He further advocated the usage of a dedicated carrier for interceptors. Crucially, Kusaka also acknowledged that there were situations when speed of reaction was more important than an escorted strike. It's clear that a number of these elements were carried forward into Combined Fleet's reassessment of its doctrine. This process continued rapidly after the fleet made port in Kure. The first, most visible change was the disbanding of 1st Air Fleet, which was renamed 3rd Fleet. The 5th Carrier Division, Shokaku and Zuikaku, was officially recognized as the core of this new carrier force and was renumbered the 1st Carrier Division. Cardiv 4, Junyo, Hiyu, and Ryujo was renumbered Cardiv 2. Battleships Hiei and Kirishima, now designated the 11th Battleship Division, were attached directly to 3rd Fleet, thereby formally removing them from the battle line and 1st Fleet. Likewise, the two operational survivors of Crew Div 7, Kumano and Suzuya, and the veterans of Crew Div 8, Tone and Chikuma, were directly attached to 3rd Fleet as well. 3rd Fleet's core unit was to remain the carrier division, but it would be a 3-ship unit composed of 2 heavy and 1 light carriers. The light carrier was charged with fleet defence and would carry primarily fighters. The heavy carriers would retain a mixed air wing, but the mixture of aircraft was adjusted. Fewer torpedo aircraft were to be carried, in preference for more fighters and dive bombers. Shokaku and Zuikaku's fighter and dive bomber complements were increased from 21 to 27 apiece, while the torpedo planes were reduced from 21 to 18. The roles of the aircraft were modified as well, with faster, more agile dive bombers designated as the main attack weapon for holing flight decks and rendering the enemy carriers inoperative. Torpedo planes would then be used to attack and sink damaged carriers. The battle plan for the carrier fleet was changed drastically as well. Much like the agonizing reappraisal that the US Navy had undergone in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy now grappled with the doctrinal consequences of its own calamity. Combined Fleet for the first time now explicitly recognized that the aircraft carrier was the center, the main objective of the decisive air battle. Surface forces will cooperate with them. The battle squadrons of the Navy were subordinated to the purposes of the carriers, a radical shift in attitude. Given its earlier triumphs, of course, it is ironic that the Imperial Navy had taken 6 months longer than its opponent to come to this conclusion. But from now on, battleships and other screening units were to be directly incorporated in the carrier fleet and would steam with them to the anticipated scene of battle. Direct visual contact would be maintained with all units, so that the force as a whole could operate under conditions of strict radio silence. The carrier fleet would also rely more heavily on the reconnaissance assets of other vessels and land-based air groups.